It's good to see everyone this evening. Appreciate your being here. I'm sure we all remember the horrible events of 9/11. And I dare say everyone here, at least adult-wise, could probably remember exactly where you were, what you were doing when you heard about or perhaps saw the events of that day on the news. In just a matter of minutes, the lives of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people were enveloped in tragedy. Wives whose husbands worked in the towers were widowed. Children who had parents working in the towers suddenly were orphaned or with only one parent. Innocent people who happened to be walking by on the street were killed or maimed. Firefighters and policemen who dealt with the aftermath suffered many health problems, and many of them were injured as they sought to help those who had been hurt. And I mention this tragedy only to illustrate the point that we never know what a day is going to bring forth. I'm reminded of the words of Solomon in Proverbs. He says, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth." And again, going back to 9/11, just in the hours prior to that terrorist attack, that day started off like many others for those people that worked in the towers or the Pentagon, whichever. You know, they got up, they went through their routines every morning, had their coffee, had their breakfast, took the train, whatever, to work. Went up to their offices, and many of these people were getting settled in for the day. It was just going to be another day among days. And just like that, tragedy struck. And I'm sure that everyone there had plans. There were people that day probably who were celebrating birthdays. There were probably people there who planned to celebrate an anniversary that night. Perhaps some were going to be retiring in a short time. Others maybe going on vacation. They all had big plans, maybe with their children or their grandchildren. And again, it suddenly changed. And while this tragedy is gigantic in proportion and affected thousands of people, every day there are lesser tragedies that affect any number of people. It may be a car accident, it may be a fire, it may be a tragic illness. The doctor says there's nothing we can do. We all face tragedies, and we don't know what a day will bring forth, do we? And I suppose the important lesson we need to learn is to prepare, to be ready, so that regardless of what a day brings forth, whether it's a national tragedy or whether it's a personal tragedy in my life, I can go on. And regardless of what happens, if I am a child of God, then I know that all things are going to work together for good, as Paul says. And that doesn't mean everything is going to come up roses, but ultimately, even when tragedy strikes as a child of God, we know there's something far greater awaiting us, far better. And even if we lose our lives, we gain our souls. And so we have a totally different perspective on life and death and tragedy that strikes. We have a perspective that unbelievers can't understand, can't appreciate. And so as children of God, we need to pillow our heads at night, and we need to pray that God will be with us through the night. But regardless of what happens, that we'll be ready. And when we get up the next day, when we wake up in the morning, we should pray that whatever happens, that we're going to be ready and live in such a way as we can stay in that state of preparation, so that when we leave this life, we can stand before God and we can hear Him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and we can enjoy that heavenly reward that's been promised to us. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, you don't have that assurance. You don't have that promise. And certainly the tragedies that you face are going to be far greater than those the Christian faces as far as the consequences. Because we only face consequences in this life, paradise in the next. But the non-Christian not only faces the problems of this life, but eternal torment in the next. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, why not become one? Coming in faith, repenting of your sins, confessing His name, and being baptized. Tonight, if you need to respond, will you come while we sing?